Today, more on bank separation in Australia. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to our latest post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today, I'm joined by Robbie Barwick from the CEC. Hello, Robbie.
Hello, Martin. How are you?
Very good. How are you going?
Very good.
I have to say, your picture has definitely improved this time around. Very impressive.
Yes, the viewers should know I take all the feedback on board. So we upgrade the camera. Someone told me to get into the 21st century.
Well, I can tell you have now. It looks very flash.
That's what the word letters HD stand for, apparently.
Oh, is that right? Okay. Highly definitional. Okay, now there's a very important conversation to have today about banking separation and the momentum that's building around that in Australia. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why that's important, not least the Senate inquiry, the IMF report, and frankly, more bad behaviour from the banks here and overseas. So I think it's an important conversation to have and to take the conversation just a little further.
Yeah, exactly. So our concern is for people to understand the urgency here. There's signs that something big is about to break in the financial system, and in discussions with other people who assume that something might be set off in Australia by an event overseas, it is very likely that an event in Australia could set off, it could be an internally generated financial crisis that may even then spread overseas, depending on the way it affects the derivatives of the banks, etc. So, the number one concern now is the real estate market, right? Down here in Melbourne, we've just officially got to 10% down, according to CoreLogic, and you know these figures better than anybody. So that those falls have accelerated, right? We're now something like 21 or 22 months of falls in the big real estate markets of Melbourne and Sydney, and the authorities must be getting very desperate, Martin, because in September 2008, or actually October 2008, when the global financial crisis was at its peak, one of the things that Kevin Rudd and his Gang of Four did was intervene in the Australian housing market by tripling the first homeowners grant. And at the same time, the Reserve Bank had slashed interest rates from 7.25% down to 3%, which they called emergency levels then, right? So the combination of those two, the slashing interest rates was a reprieve for the borrowers who were in danger of defaulting, right? And the injection of money that came with the tripled first homeowners grant, that was intended to do nothing but get the market back up again. And of course, they sold it as this is for housing affordability. They were consciously making housing more expensive. It was about propping up the market. So that's what they did after falls that was smaller than what we've experienced now. Right, and I can only imagine how desperate people are in the corridors of power to say, what do we do about this system? And then there's a larger question: is there anything they can do? I think you told me that the Northern Territory has wheeled out this $50,000 grant for home buyers, right? I mean, this is desperation stuff. Will the Reserve Bank cut more interest rates? Will that have an effect? Right? Will all these other measures have an effect? Because one of the things we have now, even more so than 2008, was a lot more debt saturation. I mean, people have got to pay this back. So, we really may be at the point now that this crash is on. Right? I don't think of it like an investor. We think politically. We think in terms of how should the government be considering what's in front of them in terms of making decisions about it. And we may be at that point now. Therefore, people have to understand that thinking about solutions now is an urgent thing. So personally, most people are going to be thinking, what do I do with my money, etc. Well, we can't give advice on that. But what we can do is identify what politically can be done, what policies can be implemented that are good for the whole country in a crisis like this. And that's where our policy is. We have multiple policies, but first and foremost, the one that we really need for people to understand is banking separation. Do something preemptively that can both protect the real economy in a crash and also start forcing these banks to reform, because that's what has not happened in 10 years. There has been no actual reform here. So that's our big, immediate urgency, and why we want to, today I want to appeal to all the viewers, and I'll keep raising this. Get involved in the fight for bank separation. By making a submission to this parliamentary inquiry. If you haven't done it yet, make it now. There's a month to go, 12th of April, so a bit less than a month, 3 weeks or roughly, 12th of April. Make a submission so they get a clear message from the Australian public. You've got to do something about the machinery that has built this problem up, right? This debt bubble up, and that starts with banking separation.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right about the timing, right? So about 3 weeks or so, and my plan will be over the next week or so to release a further video from DFA, which will hopefully be able to be a further guide for people. We can't put words in people's mouths, right? No. But what we can say is this is a big deal, and this is an important opportunity to really emphasise to those in power that the status quo is not acceptable to everyday Australians. And if enough people get involved and actually, put a submission in and basically say it's important that we actually have a banking system that works for Australia and for Australians, rather than a system that essentially just generates profits for those investors at the cost of Australians, which is what's happening, and the Royal Commission showed that in spades. It's an important opportunity, and I know that some people are very sceptical about saying, oh, look, there's no point, it won't make any difference. Look at what happened to the Royal Commission. Nothing happened after that, right? The point is, this is an opportunity, and just admitting defeat before you start is not the way to actually make change happen. So I think this is really important.
Yeah, and you've got to be more on the front lines to appreciate some of these. Sometimes subtle changes are quite significant. A lot did come out of the Royal Commission. And from my standpoint, not the least of which is suddenly all these people that had been standing silently on the sidelines came out and said, what the hell, he should have at least separated the banks, right?
Yep.
And that has built up the case for it. That said, I have to say I had a meeting last week with a leading Labor member of Parliament, and they are, right, my analysis right now is they are out to lunch, right? They would prefer to be at small target before the election and do that and commit to the bare minimum, right, and hope that gets them through. Well, as I said to him at the end, you are about to do what happened in 2007, get elected, probably most likely, and inherit financial crisis, right? And are you going to what they did in 2008 was kick the can down the road, and the can has stopped by all appearances in 2019, A couple of other things I wanted to point out that add to the urgency of this in terms of a financial crisis. So we know what's happening in Australia, and if people aren't clear on it, when we talk about real estate, real estate, in my view, I've always had a real estate crisis is a banking crisis because of how exposed the banks are to real estate. People have to understand that we can be in exactly the same position as Ireland, United States, etc. were in 2008, right? And that's most likely. But the other signs, the global signs are building as well. So like Deutsche Bank has been the centre of the global derivatives worry for a decade. Well, now their latest scheme with Deutsche Bank is can they force a merger between Deutsche Bank and some other European bank, right? And they get some. My understanding of mathematics is when a collapse is inevitable, Martin, you get to a point that whatever you do to stop it, even to stop it, can contribute to it, make it go faster, right?
Yeah.
This is something that's building now. The other thing I wanted to point out is there's these financial derivatives products called collateralized loan obligations. Now, the Australian banking expert Satyajit Das wrote about this in Bloomberg a couple of weeks ago. We've covered his article in our publication, the Australian Alert Service, this week, because it's quite serious. And so they're called CLOs, collateralized loan obligations, and the creators say, they're different from CDOs, collateralized debt obligations. Well, they're not that different. That's semantics right there. And the difference is one is based on corporate debt and one's based on mortgages, right? But the corporate debt problems are huge. But there's a concentration problem that's been identified with these things, right? And therefore the risks are there. But the size, these CLOs are roughly around the same size as CDOs got to in terms of the trade, right? So these are, when something goes wrong, the system is poised for a knock-on effect. Now, what happens in that situation, this is our concern, is we know what the authorities want to do. And the authorities, the way they're, and when I say the authorities, I mean the central banks, the treasury, the treasuries of multiple countries, etc. They have a policy. It's called bail-in, right? Our government is coy about bail-in. The IMF in its February report about Australia, though, said, listen, you have to bail in. You need a full statutory bail-in system. Now, we've already got a partial system. We've got a backdoor bail-in. That's what we've got on my sign on the back here, right? That's what passed on Valentine's Day last year. Ad hoc bail-in by the back door. We know, and you and John Adams have done the work, especially to prove that right now the mechanism is there. That in a crisis, they can come in, pull a few strings, call the banks up, redefine deposits as bail-inable, and bang, you can be on, right? Because in a crisis, things happen really fast. That's what we can already do. I think with a system like we've got, though, it's probably open to be challenged in court after the fact. I'm sure it would be. So full statutory bail-in is, let's go the whole hog, bail-in like in Europe, like in the United States, like in New Zealand, fully transparent. This is a bail-in system. Everyone knows in advance your deposits can go. The IMF has demanded that for Australia. Well, so therefore our government can be as coy as they like. The IMF is one of the top financial authorities in the world. That's what that tells you is their intention. They want bail-in, right? And the problem with bail-in, as I've said on your show before, the biggest problem with it, what makes it, why I use the word evil, because in its own merits, it's like they would say, look, if the bank's about to go, wouldn't it be better that you give up a little bit of your money to save most of it, right? And therefore, you don't lose everything. Wouldn't that be better? Well, why have they let the banks get to the position where they're about to go? After 2000, they've developed this policy after 2008 in lieu of forcing the banks to change their behaviour. That's what makes it so bad. They should have stepped in after 2008, restored Glass-Steagall in the United States. Countries copied that and imposed a whole other heap of measures designed to stop the banks, just being speculators. Make them productive contributors to society again, right? Oh no, don't do that. Don't touch the $1.2 quadrillion derivatives bubble. Don't start unwinding it. Let's just give them bigger buffers, which in this case is your savings. And as other experts said, well, you start doing that, you are destroying what gives the financial system stability, which is confidence, right? But this is the mentality of the people running the show. So that's what they will do in this crisis that's looming now. Take that seriously and think about Glass-Steagall in that context, because Glass-Steagall is like the anti-bail-in, right? Glass-Steagall is saying, okay, no, you set in place this division that takes the banks with deposits and says those deposits should be protected at all costs, so separate those banks out from everything else that could cause problems, right? And both by doing that, you're both protecting deposits, but you're defining the real financial system, right? You're not stopping the other stuff. It's most that's impossible to police. You can't control it all. It's almost no point. It's better to have a barrier, an unpassable barrier, where you have a financial system that serves the real economy that is stable by virtue of that barrier, right? So what? It's not rocket science. It's logic. The problem is it takes all the power that the banks currently have, right? It makes them servants of the economy instead of the masters they've become, and that's why they don't like it. And this is something that people are going to have to demand. But that's what I want people to understand. That's what the urgency is here, right? This financial crisis is looming, and the people in charge are going to have a default to that. Force them, demand in your submission that they instead take the banks on and make them change. That's what a submission should be.
Yeah, and just to sort of go around the houses just one more time, right? Currently, if you have a problem blow up in the derivative sector in the US or in Europe or the Eurozone, all of which could happen, right? Because of the way that our local banks are connected to those international markets and those other players, it means that they could effectively catch a cold directly from one of those issues overseas and suddenly find that they're short of funds and therefore need to be bailed in. Or it could be a locally created problem thanks to the fall in the housing market and high levels of default, but lack of liquidity because of the international scheme of things again. So either of those scenarios could trigger a need to effectively mount a rescue to the banks. And basically the two options are you bail them out, so you put more public money into them, which is what happened last time around. Well, that worked well, didn't it? Or they bail in, which is effectively they convert like deposits, which are seen effectively as unsecured loans to the banks, and suddenly those loans are translated effectively into equity. And nobody knows, of course, the value of that equity before or after, so effectively you suddenly are taking risk. And there's a couple of observations there. If you're a depositor with a bank, right, they're not paying you to take risks. The interest rates that they're paying you are so low, it's nothing like the real risks that you should be actually being rewarded for if you were a risk taker. And secondly, people still think, and I see it on my surveys all the time, that deposits are safe, right? They're at the banks, they're safe. Well, the answer is no, not necessarily, because there is this half-open door. And the trouble is, in Australia, the legislation is muddy and fuzzy, as we've shown, and so therefore it's not even simple and transparent and straightforward one the other. And I've now got more than 50 letters from people who've written to their MPs, written to the Treasury, written to all sorts of people, and copied me in on it. And every time, all the replies from Treasury and from MPs are saying, no, don't worry, because there's a 250,000 deposit security bond effectively against deposits. But that's nothing to do with bail-in.
That's right. That's right.
They completely scramble bail-in and bail-out. Now, I don't know whether it's because they don't get the difference between bailing a bank out, which is putting public money in to save a bank, and bailing in, which is to convert assets to equity to save a bank, or whether it's deliberate. But either way, it needs to stop.
Well, I think there's at least a lot of ignorance in there. When you press politicians on the details of things like the financial claims scheme, they don't know the details. They've been given a headline by someone who's an authority in their party, and they've chosen to believe it, right? And so experts, real experts like you, like Dr. Wilson Sy, the former APRA principal researcher, he first blew the whistle on the fact that the financial claims scheme isn't even activated, right? These points that get made later on, some leading politicians sometimes come out and confirm them, right? But the majority of politicians, they don't have a clue. And so they field these letters, pass them on, some authority writes back and says, no, nothing to worry about here for these reasons, and they don't think about it. And this is a problem. Because what will happen is, I'm always struck by the image if you follow the details of 2008. What's his name? Hank Paulson, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, getting on his knees to Nancy Pelosi and begging her to pass the bailout. And when in a crisis situation, these politicians do not have the wherewithal, they don't have the intestinal fortitude to stand up against these powerful pinstripe heavy hitters who are coming to them and saying, this is what you must do, or there's this threat that you, without doing that, will be responsible for the greatest meltdown of all time. They do not have the wherewithal. And that's why what we're doing preemptively is very, very important, right? If people attempted, I have to point this out, Martin, if people attempted to fall for accept the logic of those who promote bail-in, be prepared to separate the theory from the experience, right? Because we haven't had the experience. New Zealand's, they're really open about their bail-in, but they haven't had the experience, right? Southern Europe has had the experience. So there was Cyprus, there was one or two in Spain. The country with the most experience has been Italy. There's been at least 5 different type versions of bail-in in the Italian banking thing. Every single one has been a disaster. It's caught the public under. They didn't know, right? Their savings have been taken off them, right? It's not as black and white as just absolute just grabbing ordinary deposits. They pulled a few tricks, but it was essentially that was the effect. It grabbed their savings to prop up these banks. What's happened now is there's a bipartisan view in Italy that bail-in has to go. So the Italian government right now is demanding the EU drop its bail-in, abolish the bail-in system, because the EU system is across the board, right? And one of their arguments is, look, it's never averted a bailout anyway. The idea that bail-in would be a replacement for bail-out, in the real world, it's just not true, because when it comes to actually getting the liabilities down below the assets, which is the logic of bail-in, well, you've got to start taking all the liabilities into account. And so many of these liabilities are off balance sheet, but they're real. They are real liabilities, and there's not enough in the deposits to actually pay them. So let's learn from the Italians. They're jacking up, right? It's better, therefore, not to go down that path and use this opportunity to force the government to go with a bank reform process. Now, there's a lot that can be done, which we've talked about, but look on our website, etc., for more for the other policies. But I think for today, take seriously the question of making a submission. Every viewer of this channel, as I've said to you before, you're qualified. You know more about finances than most, which is one of the reasons you're on this channel. Make a submission. We've actually produced, Martin, a template of, not an actual template for the submission, but a 2-page explanation, which is on our website, and I can give you the link for it, of the details so that people are clear on everything that's involved in making a submission. All right. Follow if you're a bit uncertain, just follow that and get a submission in before the 12th of April, because the more that's there. So what will happen is, I'll just mention this now. So there's an election coming up, right? There's the budget sitting in Parliament starts the 1st of April, April Fool's Day. They're back. It's a lot of people are predicting that straight after the budget sitting, Scott Morrison will call an election. If he does that, there is therefore a chance that this inquiry we've got going into the Glass-Steagall bill that's in Parliament, the Separation of Banks bill, could be extended. And that would be great. If it's extended, that would be great. Because if it's extended, then there would be no excuse for the inquiry to hold public hearings. And we're putting pressure on them to hold public hearings, invite people like you, like the bankers who support Glass-Steagall, like other experts, come and say verbally, explain to them why Glass-Steagall is so important, because they don't get that. All they get is the Treasury, RBA, APRA, and ASIC. They take their word for it, and that's it, right? And that's for the same people that oversaw the banks to get into the mess we got into, oversaw the banks to get into the property bubble we got into, oversaw the banks with all the misconduct. They were the same people who have said up until now everything's fine, right? Who have proven to have no credibility are the ones that are going to have the final say on this. No. So public hearings will be important, but what'll help force public hearings will be the number of submissions that this inquiry gets. So if they get thousands, and I mean thousands, if they get swamped with them, and there's a demand, pressure on, you better hold hearings on this, and those hearings are public, we can start having the kind of inquiry into this subject that the Royal Commission should have been and wasn't allowed to be, right? And that's why, take this opportunity and make a submission.
Yeah, great advice, Robbie. And as you say, there are tools. We'll put the links up on the DFA site as well, so that people can follow them. And I'll be following up with another video in about a week's time, again, to provide further information and further incentives to try and encourage people to exert your right as a Australian and as a resident of Australia to send this message to those in power that this is not acceptable. What's happened over the last decade with high debt, high house prices, a banking system that has exploded out of control, it didn't have to be like this, right? So this is a way of trying to start putting things back into a rather different set of settings, which will benefit the whole of Australia later.
Yep. By the way, if people do want more information, this latest issue of our alert service has a lot of detail in it of what I've talked about here. Just call our toll-free number, right? And you can get it. You can order a free copy of that, and we'll mail it out to you. 1-800-636-432. So you can call that any time and order that. We take the responsibility to make sure we're on top of the details of this, right? And we've been doing it for, in terms of Glass-Steagall, 10 years now. In terms of bail-in, back to 2013. So, we therefore know how serious it is. But as you said at the beginning, for those who think that you can't change anything, no, there's been a lot of progress in terms of laying the foundation for change, right? So we see these sometimes what may seem subtle to someone who's not paid as much attention to us. We understand it's quite big, right? And therefore if you think where we've come in the last 18 months, Martin, I mean, there's been a lot of this has become a dominant debate in Australia in 18 months, right? And that's why this is a great opportunity. So, yeah, in my view, it's come entirely on the back of ordinary members of the public getting involved, right? And, putting aside whatever, cynicism they may have or doubts about their adequacy or whatever. No, this is our system. Look, let me make a terrible point, but it deserves to be said. There's a lunatic in New Zealand who I read the damn manifesto because that's part of my job as a politician. He put aside everything else, he said, political action doesn't work. Right? Now that is garbage. That's his set of issues were all rubbish. But I just want to point out that it's a stupid mentality he had. Right? That is rubbish. Political action does work. What is it? Most of the people have the wrong issue, frankly, and do it the wrong way. Right? But we have a democracy, and these politicians, every law that gets passed has to be voted on. Right? Most of the time, the politicians benefit from the media keeping us all distracted by all kinds of stuff, right? And people aren't getting involved. But when you can focus the public's attention, when the public can focus their attention on something that's so fundamental to all of us, right? We have a broken banking system that affects all of us. That's one of the reasons we're not a single issue party, but we hammer this because we know that you've got to take on the big issues before you can take on the small issues. And this is one of the biggest issues. We have a banking system that affects all of us. It is broken, and therefore our economy has become broken in many respects. And if the public focus on that, right, like this Glass-Steagall thing has progressed, we can make change, right? And that's the sorry to make that point, but I think it deserves to be said.
No, I think it's important. And, one of the objectives of the DFA channel is to provide information objectively and independently of mainstream media who's myopic. This is a way of trying to put issues on the table, not to tell people what to think, but to be informed, right? And so this is a great example of being informed, and then you can make your own decision about what you do. And, there is a mechanism that you can use to assert your own view and make sure that people who are in power and desire to be in power understand that we are not going to be taken prisoner by this. Actually, we have an opportunity to steer this ship in a different direction.
Yep, exactly. So, make a submission, please.
Yes, that's right. Robbie, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Martin. Appreciate it.
Okay, see ya.